Well, we began our little series in Micah towards the end of the 8th century BC. We wound forward maybe 100 years to the end of the 7th century BC, when the Neo-Assyrian Empire was in its final throes, and the prophet Nahum was speaking, and David brought us the message from Nahum last time. We're winding back again 100 years or so, to the middle of the 8th century. And this was before the threat from the Assyrian Empire seemed very real at all. They hadn't yet turned their attention southwards. They spent most of their time going and attacking the Babylonians or up in the northwest. So no great threat to the people of Israel in the land of the Holy Land there. Little did Israel realise that in just one generation, they will be completely overrun by the Assyrians, and the country of Israel will be wiped off the face of the map, never to be seen in its present form again. Let's just wind back another 300 years for a moment to the time of Samuel. I have to explain that before the time of Samuel, Samuel was one of the last of the period of the judges. Before this, Israel, the people of Israel, had been a sort of loose confederation of brotherly tribes. They came to one another's aid whenever they were under threat from other nations. The period of the judges was one where constantly different charismatic leaders came up and they prophesied and they exercised leadership, and their leadership was accepted because God's Spirit seemed to be on them. It was a very fluid and really rather egalitarian society in which Israel lived. But a moment came when the elders of Israel, it says in 1 Samuel, gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "You are old and your sons do not follow in your ways. Appoint for us then a king to govern us." And I want you to remember these next three fateful words: like other nations. Well, to cut a long story short, the Lord's response is this: yep, okay, you can have a king, and these will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50, some to plough his ground, reap his harvest, make his implements of war, and the equipment of his chariots. He'll take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He'll take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers. He'll take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and courtiers. And he'll take your male and female slaves, the best of your cattle and donkeys, and put them to work. He'll take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you in that day. And what God, through the prophet Samuel, is describing here is, quite frankly, what happens to any human organisation where there is a large concentration of power. Not just fickle King Saul, who was the first king of Israel, even warm-hearted King David, and even wise King Solomon, at the end of whose reign the people felt so fed up with the oppressive taxation system that the kingdom split apart in Solomon's son's time. And yet it wasn't that long before it only split into two, and each of the halves had a king, and each one had its own ongoing problems with over-concentration of power at the centre. Well, by the time of Amos, a two-tier class system had arisen between the haves and the have-nots. Jeroboam II had managed to establish a time of peace and prosperity, so that rich pickings could be made by those who could buy up surplus produce in the country and sell it to the captive audience in the city, especially if they were happy to sell people as well as grain. And Amos begins his prophecy right there in chapter 1, which we haven't read, by taking aim at each of Israel's neighbours in turn. He starts with Syria. He lays into them and proclaims God's judgment because of a brutal massacre in Gilead. He turns to Gaza and criticises them for displacing whole populations as a gift to Edom. He turns to Tyre and criticises for the same thing. Edom for their merciless behaviour towards their brother Israel. Really, Amos could have, his speech is worthy of a Boris Johnson or a Donald Trump in terms of its populist appeal. Israel was loving this. He turns to Ammon because of their brutality in Gilead. He turns to Moab for their brutality to Edom. By now, Israel's engaging you can just hear them engaging in your mind in enthusiastic cheering for this message. Then it's Judah's turn, Judah with whom they had this sort of love-hate relationship. Judah for not keeping the law. We're not told how they didn't keep the law. And then finally, chapter 2, verse 6, Amos fixes his gaze on Israel themselves. Let me read from the Message version. Because of the 3 great sins of Israel, I make that 4. I'm not putting up with them any longer. They buy and sell upstanding people. People are for them only things, ways of making money. They'd sell a poor man for a pair of shoes. They'd sell their own grandmother. They grind the penniless into the dirt, shove the luckless into the ditch. Everyone and his brother sleeps with the sacred whore, a sacrilege against my holy name. Stuff they've extorted from the poor is piled up at the shrine of their God. While they sit around drinking wine, they've conned from their victims. So excessive wealth has led to the creation of a leisured upper class who increasingly adopted a decadent lifestyle. Finally, when we reach today's passage in chapter 8, Amos aims his words directly at the profiteers, those who felt free to take advantage of tacit government policy that favoured the rich. Here's what he says. Hear this, you that trample on the needy and bring to ruin the poor of the land. Saying, when will the new moon be over so that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath so that we may offer wheat for sale? We'll make the ephah small and the shekel great, and practice deceit with false balances, buying the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, and selling the sweepings of the wheat. In the post-war boom, still going strong when I was a young teenager, Milton Friedman tapped into the mood at the time, saying, the ethical way for a businessman to live is to maximise shareholder profit and to follow the law of the land or social custom. Let me say that again. In simple terms, the ethical way for a businessman to live is to make as much money as possible as long as they weren't behaving illegally. It's the government's job to look after ethics. It's the businessman's ethical obligation to maximise profit. Well, that is precisely the way most companies are still run today. 3 weeks ago, I told a story of disastrous rule keeping from the public sector. So now we're on to rule keeping in the private sector. Stay legal and make as much money as you can. Note that the oppressors here in Amos chapter 8 are very religious. They abstain from doing business on Sundays, but they can't wait for the Sabbath to be over so they can get back to ripping off the people legally again. And by verse 6, they're actually reducing people to slavery, all because they're ruled by profit. Just like today. Businesses are generally run by accountants who remain distant from the sensitivities of ordinary people. Well, just 3 years after Milton Friedman made his famous statement, Ernst Schumacher wrote his now famous book, Small is Beautiful, a study of economics as if people mattered. It's a great book. And you know, the Old Testament law and prophets were unequivocal. justice and mercy must rule, not the bottom line of the balance sheet. On one level, you could say it's shocking that Donald Trump has been more interested in getting the economy going than looking after his nation's health. On another level, we have to say he's just running America as if it's a company. And almost every company is run this way. We need to be very careful about this pathological tendency to control and exploit other people. You know, there are good reasons to establish a system in which one person tells another person what to do, rescuing a group of hostages from their kidnappers, treating someone who's just experienced a cardiac arrest, putting out a fire that threatens people's lives. There are plenty of good reasons to have a system in which people do as they're told fast. There are plenty of bad reasons too. It's not just kings who build empires. David Blower last week used one or two long words, and I want to refer to them now. Paradigmatic was one of the words he used. He said empire, he was talking about the Assyrian Empire at the time, empire is paradigmatic of every kind of micro way that you and I may try to control another person. It's typical, in other words. Every day, at the moment, almost every day, I see little empires being built. Sometimes only with two people involved. Whenever one person tries to get the better of another person, gain control over them, there's a little empire being built. David used another long word, homogenization. Making everyone the same. Failing to give people the space they need to be truly and fully themselves. Racism is a very obvious example of that. Failing to give people space to be themselves. Looking at people strangely because they're different. Treating people badly because they're different. Perhaps just not speaking to them because they're different. All sorts of subtle ways we do it, but failing to give people space. It's a lovely woman who comes to Pantry that I met a few weeks back. She came over here from another country. Her husband, with whom she thought she was very much in love, started treating her brutally, eventually treated her more or less like a slave, gave her no space to be herself. Eventually she had to divorce him, she felt. And now, as she tries to make contact with others in her community, they don't give her freedom to be herself because she's now a divorcee, and they don't like divorcees. Such stifling place to be when other people just won't give you the space to be who you are. Whenever empires are built, whether they're at the macro level or the micro human relationship level, the weak suffer. And Amos wants us to be in no doubt as to whose side God is on in that conflict. My friends, who are you trying to control? Where are you trying to build your little empire? Because wherever it is, know that God is on the other person's side. What's the difference between kingdom building and empire building? It's another question that David posed last week. That's for us to work hard at figuring out. But I do have a piece of advice. Look long and hard at the life of Jesus, the king who doesn't seem to behave like a king should. Well, despite Amos's devastating critique of just about everybody, he is still optimistic about the final outcome. Optimistic because he knows that the weak, poor and vulnerable with God in their side are stronger than those who love to look very religious but are oppressors at heart. I'm going to close with the words of Amos 5, verses 21 to 24. Amos says, I despise your festivals. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals, I will not look on. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream.